A web of lies, unveiling the affair. I never imagined that bringing my wife lunch would lead to the unraveling of my entire life. For 10 years, Mai and I had built something together. Our marriage wasn't perfect, whose is, but we had love, stability, and a shared vision for the future. Or so I thought. The day started like any other. It was a bright Tuesday morning, and I was working from home. My job in finance allowed for occasional flexibility, and I relished these days, where I could work in comfortable silence. Mai had already left for work in a rush, as usual, barely touching the breakfast I had made. She was always busy these days, caught up in her marketing career at a rapidly growing company, where she had just been promoted. I remember watching her from the kitchen as she grabbed her bag and darted toward the door. She hadn't noticed the lunch I'd prepared sitting on the counter. A small gesture, but one I did often. She used to love it when I packed her favorite sandwiches in. Snacks. It was something small, but it felt meaningful, until it didn't. In those early days of our marriage, everything seemed easy. We had met in our mid-20s, both of us ambitious and driven in our careers. Mai's enthusiasm for life, her love of adventure, had drawn me to her instantly. I was more of a planner, methodical in my approach to everything, but she was spontaneous, always pushing me out of my comfort zone. She was the spark that ignited my otherwise ordinary life, and I loved her for it. Our wedding had been small, just family and close friends. I still remember the way she looked that day, walking down the aisle, her smile brighter than the summer sun. We had dreamed together, planned our lives in a way that felt invincible. We wanted to travel, to see the world, to eventually have kids when the time was right. Everything seemed so clear back then. But life doesn't always follow the script you write. As the years passed, work took over. I climbed the corporate ladder. In finance, while Mai's career in marketing blossomed. At first, we balanced it well, date nights, weekend getaways, time to reconnect. But as she grew more successful, her time became more consumed by the job. I understood, because I was in the same boat. We were both career-driven, and I took pride in her success. Yet, in the back of my mind, I had begun to notice the cracks forming between us. We spoke less. The intimacy that once felt natural became scheduled, routine. We stopped sharing our deepest thoughts and feelings, filling the silence with talk about work or what show to watch on Netflix. The distance between us grew gradually, and though I felt it, I never thought it would lead to something like this. Flashback, the first warning sign. It was a Saturday evening, and Mai and I had been invited to a company event, a casual dinner hosted by her boss, Mr. Min. It was the first time I'd met him, though Mai had mentioned him countless times. From the way she spoke about him, I expected someone charismatic, someone who commanded respect. What I didn't expect was the subtle tension that hung in the air between them during that dinner. We arrived at his home, a sleek, modern apartment in the city, and were greeted warmly by Min and his wife. They seemed like the perfect couple at first glance, both successful, well-spoken, and charming. As the evening progressed, I found myself having a few pleasant conversations with Min, discussing work, travel, and other mundane topics. But what stuck with me wasn't our conversation, it was the way he interacted with Mai. It started with small things. A hand that lingered on her back for just a second too long. The way his eyes would light up when she spoke. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just a friendly rapport. But then I noticed the way Mai responded. The way she leaned in a little too closely when he talked, how her laugh seemed to come easier when he said something funny. During dinner, when they were seated next to each other, I caught a moment when their knees brushed beneath the table. I watched as Mai pulled her leg away, only to have him shift closer again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. My stomach tightened. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was nothing. After all, Mai and I had been together for years. We were happy, weren't we? There was no way anything was going on between them. It wasn't until much later that I realized that moment had been the first warning sign. The office revelation. After an hour of working that morning, I noticed the lunch still on the counter. She's probably going to be hungry by noon, I thought to myself. With a smile, I decided I'd drop it off for her. A little surprise to brighten her day. Maybe it would even spark some conversation when she came home that night. Lately, our talks had become so short, so mechanical. Mai was always busy, always stressed, and when I brought it up, she would assure me it was just work. Driving to her office, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more than a simple act of kindness. Deep down, I knew I had other reasons for showing up unannounced. I had noticed the changes, subtle at first, then glaring. Late nights, the vague excuses, the sudden need to be on call for her boss. And then there was the phone. It had become an ever-present fixture in her hand, the screen always turned away from me. The elevator ride to the 9th floor felt longer than usual. I was nervous, but I couldn't quite place why. When the doors slid open, I walked down the hallway to Mai's office, her nameplate on the door gleaming in the overhead light. I noticed the door wasn't closed fully, just ajar enough for me to hear voices from inside. I stopped, ready to knock, but then I heard something that made my heart stop. Laughter. Not just any laughter, it was Mai's. And not just her laughter, but Mr. Min's voice, her boss, followed closely behind. It was the kind of laughter I hadn't heard from her in months, the kind that once belonged to us, in our early days. At first, I thought it was just a light-hearted conversation. Maybe something funny had happened at work. But the tone shifted. Their voices dropped to hushed whispers, playful, intimate. Then, I heard Mai speak in a voice I barely recognized, soft, seductive. "I can't believe you convinced me to stay late again," she teased. My blood turned cold. My hand, frozen in midair, fell back to my side. A knot formed in my stomach, and I stood there, immobile, as my worst fear came to life. The two people inside were far more than just colleagues. I strained to hear more, not that I needed to, and my worst suspicions were confirmed when Mr. Min's voice followed. "You know I'd do anything to spend more time with you." There was a brief pause, and then, unmistakably, I heard the sound of a kiss. The weight of discovery. I staggered back, my mind a swirl of confusion, disbelief, and rage. The lunch bag slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. I wanted to storm in, to confront them both. I wanted to shout, to demand answers. But I couldn't move. Instead, I turned and walked swiftly back down the hall, every step heavier than the last. I barely remember driving home. It felt like I was outside my body, watching from a distance as everything I thought I knew crumbled around me. The woman I had built a life with, the woman I loved, had been lying to me for who knows how long. She was with him, her boss. The puzzle pieces finally fit, the late nights, the sudden work trips, the coldness in our bed. Back at home, I paced the living room like a caged animal. I replayed every interaction, every moment of the last few months, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when things started to change. Was it when she got promoted? Or was it before that? How had I missed the signs? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? The confrontation. Hours passed. I tried to distract myself, but every time I sat down, my mind returned to the same dark place. I went over the words I would say to her, rehearsing the confrontation in my head, but none of it felt real. Would she admit it? Would she try to deny it? Or worse, would she brush it off, as if it were nothing? The sound of the front door opening pulled me from my thoughts. Mai was home. She stepped inside, her face weary, her eyes tired, but she smiled when she saw me, as if everything were normal. As if she hadn't just spent the day with another man. "Hey," she said softly, setting her bag down on the table. "How was your day?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was tight, my chest constricted with the weight of what I had to say. She paused, sensing the tension. "What's wrong?" "I went by your office today," I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. Her face paled instantly. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything to anchor herself to. You did, she finally stammered. I nodded, my gaze locked on her, searching her face for any sign of remorse. I heard you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I heard you and Min. There it was. The truth, out in the open. For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of my words hanging between us like a guillotine about to fall. Mai's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, stepping closer to me. It's not what you think, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's not. Don't, I said, cutting her off. Don't lie to me, Mai. I know what I heard. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I didn't mean for this to happen, she cried. It just got out of control. I'm so sorry. I stood there, staring at her, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers, but another part of me was too tired. Too broken. How long? I asked, my voice hollow. How long has this been going on? Mai wiped at her tears, but she didn't answer right away. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. A few months, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. It started with work, we were just spending so much time together, and then. I don't know. I never meant for it to go this far. A few months. She had been lying to me for months. Aftermath, the silent days. The days following the confrontation were some of the hardest of my life. We didn't speak much. Mai spent most of her time at work, and I buried myself in my own job, trying to ignore the growing distance between us. But no matter how hard I tried, the truth was always there, gnawing at me, consuming me. Mai had apologized over and over again, promising that it was over, that she would cut all ties with Min. She begged me to forgive her, to give our marriage another chance. But I couldn't. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. At night, I slept in the guest room. I couldn't bear to be near her, to share the same bed with someone who had betrayed me so deeply. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and empty, a hollow shell of the life we once had. I thought about leaving her. Packing my things and walking away. But every time I started to, something held me back. I didn't know if it was love, or fear, or just the weight of 10 years together, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. Therapy and the struggle for forgiveness. We tried therapy. At first, it felt like a step in the right direction. Our therapist, a calm woman with kind eyes, asked us to open up about our feelings, to communicate honestly with each other. But every session felt like a chore, dredging up more pain, more resentment. Every time I looked at Mai, all I could see was her with him. The memory of that day at the office played on a loop in my mind, torturing me. One evening, after another failed therapy session, Mai broke down. I don't know what else to do, she sobbed. I've apologized 1,000 times, I've tried everything, but nothing I say seems to matter to you. I looked at her, my heart heavy with guilt and anger. It's not that I don't hear you, I said, my voice low. It's that I can't forget what you did. Every time I look at you, I see him. Her face crumpled, and for the first time in weeks, I saw real despair in her eyes. She was desperate for forgiveness, for me to move past this and rebuild what we had. But could I? Could I ever truly forgive her? Flashback, the early years. As the days dragged on, I found myself thinking more and more about the early years of our relationship, before everything had gone wrong. I remembered the first time I met Mai. It was at a mutual friend's birthday party, and I had been immediately drawn to her. She was different from anyone I'd ever met, confident, funny, with a smile that could light up a room. We spent the whole evening talking, and by the end of the night, I knew I wanted tea. Oh, see her again. Our first date was a disaster, at least by most standards. We had planned to meet at a new restaurant downtown, but I got stuck in traffic and was nearly an hour late. By the time I arrived, Mai was sitting at the bar, sipping a glass of wine, looking like she was ready to leave. But instead of being angry, she laughed when she saw me, waving off my apologies as if they were nothing. That's when I knew she was special. Our relationship had been easy in those early days. We shared the same values, the same sense of humor, the same love for adventure. We talked about everything, our hopes, our fears, our plans for the future. There was never any doubt in my mind that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. And for a while, it seemed like that was exactly what we were doing. We bought a house together, we traveled, we made plans for the future. But somewhere along the way, we had lost that connection. The life we had built together had slowly unraveled, and I hadn't even realized it until it was too late. The decision. Weeks passed, and the silence between us deepened. The therapy sessions became less frequent, the attempts to rekindle what we once had felt forced, like two people playing a role they no longer believed in. One night, as I lay awake in the guest room, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything would go back to the way it was before. The trust was gone, and without it, there was no foundation left to build on. The next morning, I sat down with Mai in the kitchen. She looked at me, her eyes filled with fear, as if she knew what was coming. I think it's time, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Time for what? She whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. For us to let go, I replied, pulling my hands away gently. We can't keep pretending this is working. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, and that's not fair to either of us. Mai's face crumpled, and she started to cry, but I didn't move to comfort her. This was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do, but I knew it was the right decision. A few weeks later, I moved out. The house, the life we had built, the memories we shared, it was all behind me now. It hurt, but in a way, it was a relief. The weight of the betrayal had lifted, and for the first time in months, I could breathe again. Moving forward. Months passed after I moved out. At first, I stayed with a friend, drowning in the chaos of my own thoughts. I tried to focus on work, on rebuilding some semblance of a life without Mai, but the memories of what we had shared, and what we had lost, haunted me. Mai reached out occasionally, asking for updates, pleading for another chance. She swore that she had changed, that she would never hurt me again. Part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me longed for the comfort of what we once had. But every time I considered going back, the image of her and Mr. Min would flash through my mind, and I knew that trust was something I could never fully regain. In the end, I filed for divorce. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but also the most necessary. Some wounds never fully heal, and some betrayals are too deep to forgive. Life after Mai was difficult at first, but eventually, the pain began to fade. Slowly, I started to rebuild, focusing on myself, on my future. I realized that love, real love, is built on trust and respect, both of which had been destroyed beyond repair. And as for Mai, I hope she finds what she's looking for. But it won't be with me.